I need to tell you about what happened to my daughter Emma on October 2nd, not because I fully understand it myself, but because she made me promise I would share it with anyone willing to listen. My name is David Chen. I'm 42 years old, and I work as a high school history teacher in Portland, Oregon. My wife, Sarah, is a pediatric nurse, and until that Wednesday in October, we thought we had a pretty normal life with our 3 kids. Emma is our middle child, just turned 14 last August. She's always been different from her older brother, Marcus, and younger sister, Lily. While Marcus obsesses over basketball and Lily can't stop talking about her friends, Emma has always been the quiet one, the observer, the kid who would rather sit by the window and watch the rain than scroll through social media like everyone else her age. We raised all 3 kids in the church, nothing extreme, just regular Sunday services at a small community congregation where people actually know each other's names. But Emma took it more seriously than the others. She would ask questions during family devotions that made Sarah and me exchange glances. Questions about suffering and grace and whether God really speaks to people anymore like he did in biblical times. The day it happened, Emma had stayed home from school with what we thought was a bad migraine. She gets them occasionally, inherited from Sarah's side of the family, and we've learned to just let her rest in a dark room until they pass. Sarah had left for her shift at the children's hospital. Marcus was at basketball practice, and Lily was at a friend's house. I was downstairs grading papers when I heard the most terrifying sound a parent can hear. Complete silence followed by a heavy thud from Emma's bedroom. I took those stairs 3 at a time and found my daughter collapsed on her bedroom floor, her body rigid, eyes wide open, but seeing nothing I could perceive. Her lips were moving, but no sound was coming out. I'm not a medical person like Sarah, but I know what a seizure looks like, and this wasn't that. Emma's pulse was strong, her breathing steady, but she was completely unreachable, trapped somewhere between this world and somewhere else entirely. I called 911 immediately, then Sarah, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. The paramedics arrived within 7 minutes, which felt like 7 hours, and they were as confused as I was. All her vital signs were perfectly normal, but Emma remained in this state of frozen consciousness, present physically but absent in every other way that mattered. They transported her to the hospital where Sarah works, which felt like both a blessing and a curse. Sarah met us in the emergency room, her professional composure barely masking the terror in her eyes as she looked at our daughter lying motionless on the gurney. The attending physician, Dr. Martinez, ran every test imaginable: CT scans, MRIs, EEGs, blood work, toxicology screens. Everything came back completely normal, which somehow made it more frightening than if they had found something wrong. Emma remained in that suspended state for 43 minutes, according to the hospital records. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, she gasped like someone breaking through the surface of deep water, her eyes focusing on Sarah and me with an intensity I had never seen in my daughter before. The first thing she said in a voice that sounded older than her 14 years was this: "Daddy, I saw him. I saw Jesus, and he showed me what's coming. He told me I was too young to carry this alone, but that you would help me tell people because they need to know." Dr. Martinez wanted to keep her overnight for observation, concerned about hallucinations or neurological issues they might have missed. But Emma insisted she was fine, more than fine, actually. And every subsequent test confirmed she was medically perfect. We took her home that evening with strict instructions to return immediately if anything similar happened again. That night, after we had gotten Marcus and Lily to bed and the house was finally quiet, Emma sat between Sarah and me on the living room couch and told us everything she had experienced during those 43 minutes when her body was present, but her consciousness was somewhere else entirely. She described being pulled out of her bedroom, not physically, but spiritually, lifted above our neighborhood and then above the entire city of Portland. She could see the Columbia River winding through the landscape like a silver ribbon. Mount Hood, standing sentinel in the distance. The lights of the city spread out below her like scattered stars. Then she was higher still, above the clouds, above the atmosphere, until Earth itself looked like a blue marble suspended in infinite darkness. She wasn't afraid, though. She felt more peaceful than she had ever felt in her entire life, wrapped in warmth and love that made every good feeling she had ever experienced seem like a pale shadow by comparison. That's when she saw the light approaching, not like sunlight or artificial light, but something alive and intelligent and so beautiful it made her cry just remembering it. The light took form gradually, resolving into a figure she recognized instantly, even though she had never seen him with physical eyes before. Emma described Jesus in detail that made Sarah grip my hand so tightly I lost feeling in my fingers. She said he looked like someone who had worked with his hands his whole life, strong and capable, with eyes that held both infinite gentleness and absolute authority. She noticed the scars on his hands and feet immediately, but they weren't ugly wounds. They glowed with light from within, like windows into something holy and incomprehensible. When he spoke her name, Emma said it felt like every cell in her body was responding to a frequency it had been designed to recognize. Not scary, but overwhelming in its rightness, like a piano string vibrating in perfect resonance with a master musician's touch. He told her she had been faithful in small things, in her quiet prayers when her siblings mocked her for being too serious, in her kindness to the lonely kids at school, in her genuine desire to know truth rather than just believe what was comfortable. He said these things mattered more than all the loud displays of religion that fill up churches and social media. Then his expression became serious, Emma said, and he told her he was about to show her things that would be difficult to witness but necessary to understand. He said the world was racing toward a cliff edge and most people were too distracted by their devices and their entertainment and their busy lives to notice. Something had to wake them up before it was too late, not to punish them, but to give them one last chance to choose what really matters. Emma described being shown 3 separate visions, 3 periods of darkness that would sweep across the earth in the coming months. The first would be technological, the second spiritual, and the third a combination of both that would fundamentally transform human civilization forever. In the first vision, Emma watched as a massive solar storm struck Earth with unprecedented force. She said Jesus explained that this would happen on November 15th at precisely 3:33 in the afternoon Eastern Time. The electromagnetic pulse would disable virtually every piece of modern technology across North America and large portions of other continents. She described seeing cars stopping suddenly on freeways, planes being forced to make emergency landings, cell phone towers becoming useless. But more importantly, she watched what happened to people when their technology stopped working. The initial panic and confusion gave way to something unexpected. People started actually looking at each other instead of their screens. Families who had been strangers living in the same house began having real conversations. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years started helping each other. Emma said Jesus showed her specific families and explained that this first darkness would last exactly 3 days, 72 hours, when people would be forced to slow down, to be present, to remember what it felt like to be human without constant digital mediation. Many people would die, especially those dependent on technology for medical support. But millions more would experience a spiritual awakening they desperately needed. She watched prayer meetings forming spontaneously across darkened cities. She saw people who hadn't prayed sincere prayers in decades falling to their knees, not just out of fear, but from sudden awareness of how empty their lives had become. Churches that had been half empty for years were suddenly packed with people hungry for something real, something that would sustain them when their familiar comforts disappeared. Jesus told Emma that the death toll would be significant, but that more souls would enter his kingdom during those 3 days than in the previous 5 years combined. He said this with such sorrow for the lives lost, but also such joy for the spiritual harvest that would result. The first darkness would end exactly 72 hours after it began, Emma said. Power would start returning, technology would gradually come back online, and most people would rush back to their old patterns. But not everyone. Some would remember what they experienced during those quiet days and would choose to live differently, to keep prioritizing what really matters even when the distractions returned. Then Jesus showed her the second darkness, scheduled for March 20th, 2026, exactly 4 months after the first one ended. Emma's voice got quieter when she described this part, and I could see her struggling with how to explain something that defied natural explanation. This darkness would be completely different, she said. Not technological, but supernatural. At midnight Eastern Time on the spring equinox, a darkness would descend that had nothing to do with the absence of light and everything to do with the presence of spiritual reality becoming visible. Emma described watching as some people walked through this darkness as if surrounded by a gentle glow, while others stumbled around in terror so complete they couldn't function. The difference had nothing to do with whether lights were working or not. The darkness was revealing the true spiritual condition of every soul on earth. Those who had genuine faith in Jesus, who had actual relationship with him rather than just religious performance, carried light within them that enabled them to see clearly, even in supernatural darkness. But those who had rejected him or treated faith as an insurance policy rather than a transforming relationship found themselves in blackness deeper than anything physical. Emma cried when she described watching families divided by this phenomenon. Parents who could see perfectly trying to help teenage children who were completely blind because they had rejected faith. But she also saw incredible mercy. As parents prayed over their kids and guided them through the darkness with patient love, many young people broke down and genuinely turned to Jesus. The moment they did, light flooded around them like sunrise. She said Jesus told her that roughly 150 million people across North America would genuinely accept him during those 3 supernatural days. Churches would be overwhelmed with people seeking baptism and discipleship. Underground networks of believers would form. Casual Christians would become passionate evangelists. The conversion rate would be unprecedented in human history. But then Emma's expression became fearful as she described the third vision, and Sarah and I both felt the temperature in the room seemed to drop. The final darkness was scheduled for August 15th, 2026, 5 months after the second event. This one would combine elements of both previous darknesses, but multiplied beyond anything that came before. The electromagnetic pulse from this third event would be so powerful, it would physically destroy power grids rather than just disable them temporarily. Transformers would explode, power lines would melt, even simple electronics would be vaporized. The technological civilization humans had built over the past century would essentially end. But the spiritual component was even more intense. The same supernatural darkness would return, but this time it would reveal not just the condition of souls, but the actual spiritual realm itself. Believers would see angels, would experience God's presence so tangibly they would lack nothing despite the collapse of modern systems. But those who rejected Jesus would see the demonic realm they had been flirting with their whole lives, and some would go insane from the revelation. Emma said Jesus showed her communities that had learned from the first 2 darknesses and were ready for the third. They had built relationships, learned practical skills, stored supplies, and most importantly, had unshakable faith. While other areas descended into chaos and violence, these communities maintained peace and order and hope. But he also showed her churches and supposed believers who failed the test. People whose conversions during the second darkness had been motivated by fear rather than genuine faith, who abandoned their commitments when following Jesus required actual sacrifice. Emma wept as she described watching pastors abandon their congregations and new believers falling away when comfort was threatened. The third darkness would also last exactly 3 days, Emma said. But when it ended, the world would be fundamentally different. Not ended, but transformed. The survivors would have learned what really matters. They would build new communities based on relationship rather than consumption, on faith rather than technology, on love rather than fear. Then Emma said Jesus became very urgent and told her that time was shorter than people realized. The first darkness was only 5 weeks away at that point. People who wanted to be prepared needed to start immediately. Not preparing with fear and paranoia, but preparing with faith and community and practical wisdom. He told Emma that she was too young to carry this message alone, which is why he was allowing her father, meaning me, to help share it. He said I would know how to translate her experience into words others could understand, and that together we would reach people who needed to hear this warning while there was still time. Emma said the last thing Jesus told her before she returned to her body was this: the darknesses are not punishments, but invitations. Invitations for people to come home to him, to rediscover authentic human community, to build lives that can withstand any storm. Those who accept the invitation will find that even the darkest nights lead to the most glorious dawns. Then she was back in her body, gasping for air, surrounded by worried doctors and terrified parents, forever changed by what she had witnessed. In the days following Emma's experience, Sarah and I struggled with how to respond. As a history teacher, I'm trained to think critically about sources and claims. As a nurse, Sarah deals in measurable realities and medical evidence. Neither of us are prone to mystical experiences or apocalyptic thinking. We're practical people who believe in God, but also believe in reason. Yet here was our 14-year-old daughter, previously healthy, now claiming to have received a detailed prophetic vision about 3 coming periods of darkness. A daughter who had never been prone to exaggeration or attention-seeking, who was clearly struggling with the weight of what she believed she had been shown. We took Emma to see our pastor, Reverend Thomas, a thoughtful man in his 60s who had been leading our congregation for over 20 years. He listened to Emma's entire account without interruption, occasionally nodding, his expression growing more serious as she described each darkness in detail. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment before speaking. Emma, I've been a pastor for 38 years, and I can tell you that what you're describing is consistent with biblical patterns of prophetic revelation. The specific dates, the detailed visions, the urgent warning combined with hope, these are all markers of genuine encounters. But I also know that extraordinary claims require extraordinary discernment. He suggested we pray and fast as a family, asking God for wisdom about how to proceed. He also pointed out something that gave me chills. The first darkness Emma described was supposedly coming on November 15th, just 5 weeks away at that point. If her vision was genuine, we wouldn't have to wait long for confirmation. If November 15th came and went without incident, we would know the experience was likely a hallucination or false vision. But if November 15th brought exactly what Emma described, then we would need to take the second and third warnings very seriously and help others prepare. We decided as a family to share Emma's experience cautiously with our close friends and church community, not demanding they believe, but simply offering it as something to consider and pray about. The reactions were mixed. Some people were immediately receptive, saying they had felt something stirring in their spirits about coming challenges. Others were politely skeptical, treating it like an interesting story, but not something to actually change their lives over. A few people reacted with outright hostility, accusing us of fear, mongering, or trying to manipulate people. That hurt more than the skepticism. especially watching Emma's face crumble when adults she respected dismissed her experience as adolescent fantasy. But Emma remained steady. She didn't argue with skeptics or try to convince doubters. She simply repeated what she had been shown and left the rest to God. I was proud of her maturity, even as I wrestled with my own doubts about whether I was helping my daughter or enabling something problematic. As November 15th approached, I found myself constantly checking space weather forecasts and solar activity reports online. There were predictions of elevated solar activity, but nothing indicating the massive coronal mass ejection Emma had described. Part of me was relieved, thinking maybe this would all turn out to be a strange episode we could eventually forget about. But another part of me, the part that had watched my daughter's face as she described meeting Jesus, couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was coming. November the 15th was a Friday. I remember because Marcus had a basketball game that evening that we were planning to attend. Sarah had the day off from the hospital. Lily was excited about a sleepover at her friend's house that weekend. Everything felt completely normal as we went about our morning routines. At 3:33 in the afternoon Pacific time, which would be 6:33 Eastern time, as Emma had specified, I was in my classroom preparing for Monday's lessons. My phone was sitting on my desk, fully charged. I was working on my laptop, music playing softly from my wireless speaker. Then everything stopped. Not gradually, not with any warning, just stopped. My phone screen went black. My laptop shut down instantly. The music cut off mid-note. The overhead lights flickered once and went dark. Through the window, I could see car alarms triggering across the parking lot, then falling silent as their electronic systems failed. For a moment, I just stood there, my heart pounding, unable to process what was happening. Then Emma's voice echoed in my memory, describing exactly this scenario, and I felt ice water flood through my veins. It was real. All of it was real. I tried my phone repeatedly, knowing it wouldn't work, but unable to stop myself. Nothing. Dead. Not even a flicker of response. I grabbed my keys and ran to my car, but the moment I turned the key, I knew it was useless. The engine didn't even try to turn over. No dashboard lights, no response whatsoever. Around me, I could see other teachers and students emerging from buildings, confusion and growing panic on their faces. Some were shouting, asking what was happening. Others were trying desperately to get their phones working. A few seemed to be catching on faster than others that this was far more serious than a simple power outage. I started running toward home about 3 miles from the school. The streets were already chaos. Cars had coasted to stops wherever they happened to be when the pulse hit. Some drivers were getting out and looking under hoods as if they could find some simple mechanical problem to fix. Traffic lights were dark throughout the city. In the distance, I could hear sirens, probably emergency vehicles that had been running on older, simpler technology. By the time I reached our house, I was drenched in sweat despite the cool November air. Sarah's car was in the driveway, as dead as every other vehicle in the city. I burst through the front door calling for my family. They were all in the living room. Sarah had Emma and Lily gathered close, and Marcus was standing by the window, looking out at the darkening neighborhood with wide eyes. When Emma saw me, she burst into tears. Not upset tears, but something more complicated. Relief, maybe, or vindication, or just the overwhelming weight of knowing that everything she had been shown was beginning to unfold exactly as prophesied. "It's happening, isn't it?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Everything Emma saw. "It's actually happening." I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. We stood there as a family, holding each other as darkness fell across Portland and across the entire continent. No street lights flickered on, no house lights glowed in windows. Just the natural darkness of evening settling over a civilization that had suddenly been thrust back into a pre-technological age. That first night was the longest of my life. We had candles and flashlights, thank God, and our gas stove still worked for cooking. Sarah had been quietly preparing after Emma's vision, stocking extra food and water despite her own skepticism, just in case. Now we were grateful for her practical nature. Marcus and Lily were frightened, but handling it better than I expected. Emma was quiet, sitting by the window and watching the darkened city with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not satisfaction, certainly not that, but perhaps a kind of sad peace, knowing that what was unfolding was necessary despite being difficult. We gathered the kids close and talked through what we should expect based on Emma's vision. 3 days of this technological darkness. Many people would die, especially those dependent on medical equipment or those caught in dangerous situations when everything stopped working. There would be panic and confusion, possibly violence as people struggled to understand what was happening. But there would also be something beautiful emerging from the chaos. People would start actually connecting with each other. Communities would form organically. Those who knew how to pray would start praying, and those who had forgotten would suddenly remember. The next 3 days unfolded exactly as Emma had described. We heard stories from neighbors who ventured out. Spontaneous gatherings forming at the community center where people shared resources and information. Churches opening their doors, not for formal services, but for community support and prayer. People who barely knew each other the week before were now organizing meal sharing and childcare cooperatives. Our own church became a hub of activity. Reverend Thomas rose to the occasion magnificently, organizing teams to check on elderly members, to pool resources, to provide comfort and leadership to a frightened congregation. Emma sat in several prayer meetings, quietly describing what she had been shown, no longer dismissed as a fanciful teenager, but recognized as someone who had genuinely received prophetic insight. On the third day, November 18th, at exactly 3:33 in the afternoon Pacific time, I was outside helping neighbors organize a community garden for the coming spring when I felt it. A subtle shift in the air, a kind of collective exhale from the universe itself. Within minutes, a few people's phones began showing signs of life. Car alarms started chirping as electrical systems slowly came back online. The first darkness was ending, exactly as Emma had said it would. Over the following weeks, as power slowly returned and society began the massive work of recovery and repair, Sarah and I watched our daughter closely. Emma had been vindicated in the most dramatic way possible, yet she didn't act triumphant or superior. If anything, she seemed more burdened than before, knowing that 2 more darknesses were coming and that each would be more intense than the last. We made the decision to share Emma's complete testimony more widely. I wrote everything down, exactly as she had described it to us, exactly as I'm sharing with you now. We started posting online, attending community meetings, doing whatever we could to help people understand what had happened and prepare for what was coming. The response has been overwhelming. Some people are hungry for this information, desperately wanting to prepare physically and spiritually for the challenges ahead. Others remain skeptical despite the accuracy of the first vision, preferring to believe the November event was just an unusual but explainable natural phenomenon. That's why I'm sharing this now, exactly as Emma told it to us and exactly as we experienced the first darkness ourselves. Not to frighten anyone, but because my daughter believes, and I now believe, that God is offering humanity an incredible gift, an opportunity to wake up, to remember what really matters, to build lives and communities that can withstand any storm because they're founded on faith rather than technology, on love rather than fear, on eternal truth rather than temporary comfort. The second darkness is scheduled for March 20th, 2026, the third for August 15th. Emma has described both in detail, and after watching the first unfold exactly as she prophesied, Sarah and I have no doubt the others will come as well. We're not asking you to just believe us. We're asking you to prepare, to pray, to build community, to deepen your relationship with Jesus while there's still time. Because according to what Emma was shown, these darknesses are not punishments, but invitations. Invitations to come home, to rediscover authentic human connection, to build lives that matter beyond the surface distractions we've allowed to dominate our attention. If you're reading this, it means you stayed until the end, which suggests something in this testimony resonated with your spirit. We would be grateful if you would let us know where you're reading from, so we can pray for your community and your nation. Share this account with people you care about, not to spread fear, but to spread hope and preparedness. Most importantly, take time today to examine your own relationship with God, not your religious performance or your church attendance, but your actual connection to Jesus. Because according to what my 14-year-old daughter was shown during those 43 minutes when her spirit left her body, that relationship is the only thing that will matter when the second and third darknesses arrive. Emma often tells people who ask about her experience that the darknesses themselves aren't the point. The point is what they're designed to accomplish. Waking up a sleeping world, separating genuine faith from comfortable religion, creating communities that reflect God's design for human flourishing. The darknesses are difficult, but what emerges on the other side is more beautiful than anything we've lost. We don't know why God chose our family, why he gave this vision to a quiet 14-year-old girl in Portland instead of to some famous evangelist or influential church leader. But Emma says Jesus told her that he often works through the unlikely and the overlooked, through ordinary people who are simply willing to be faithful with what they've been given. So that's what we're trying to do. Be faithful with what we've been given. Share the warning while there's time. Help people prepare not just physically, but spiritually for the challenges ahead. And trust that God's purposes are good even when his methods are difficult to understand. The clock is counting down to March 20th. We pray you'll use the time wisely, not in fear, but in faith, preparing your heart and your household for what's coming. Because Emma is absolutely certain, and after witnessing the first darkness unfold, exactly as she described, so are we, that Jesus is offering humanity one last chance to choose what really matters before the old world passes away and something new begins. May God bless you and keep you in the days ahead. May you find community, deepen your faith, and be ready for whatever comes. And may you remember when the darkness falls, that it's not the end, but an invitation to step into the light that never fails. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this testimony. If you're still here, it means God has spoken to your heart. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from so we can pray for your nation. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss the messages we share. And please share this video with at least 3 people you love, because one click can bring hope, faith, and new life in Christ. May the Lord bless and guide you always.